19 years old, never been outside your town, never held a rifle. You joined because the boys on your street joined, because a poster told you your country needed you, because saying no felt like the shameful option, so you said yes. Now you're somewhere in France, a hole in the ground, mud so thick it swallows your boots whole. The man next to you hasn't moved in 2 hours. You tell yourself he's sleeping. You don't actually believe that. And then your legs just go. No decision, no plan. Your body made the choice before your brain could stop it. 6 weeks later, you're standing in front of a firing squad. Men you ate with, men you slept beside in the cold, men who know your name. Your crime, according to the British Army? Cowardice. And here's the thing. Nobody in that courtroom stopped to ask the real question. The one that changes everything. What if it wasn't cowardice at all? What if it was something else entirely? Something the Army had no interest in understanding. Most people who know this history nod along. War is brutal. Discipline matters. Harsh times call for harsh measures. But that version of the story leaves something out. Because these men weren't weak. They weren't criminals. They were carrying something invisible. Something that was quietly dismantling them from the inside out. And the British Army's answer to that? A bullet. To understand how a nation got here, how soldiers ended up being executed by their own side, we need to go back to where it all began. Picture a world that barely makes sense anymore. Miles of trenches carved into Belgian and French soil, wet, dark, freezing in winter, and suffocating in summer. The smell of rotting flesh is constant. Artillery never truly stops. It is background noise now, like rain. Except this rain kills. Men live in these trenches for weeks at a time. They eat cold food in the dark. They sleep, when they sleep at all, sitting upright against walls of packed mud. They watch their friends disappear in an instant. They see things no human mind was built to process. By 1917, over 300 British and Commonwealth soldiers had been executed by their own military. Not by the enemy, by their own side. Shot at dawn, as the official phrase went. 306, to be exact. The charges varied. Desertion, cowardice, disobedience. But the patterns were eerily similar. These weren't hardened criminals. Most were ordinary men, young men, farmers, factory workers, sons. And one of them was a boy from a small village in Norfolk named Private Harry Farr. Harry Farr was 25 years old when he enlisted in 1914. He was a working man, modest, quiet. He had a wife named Gertrude and a daughter he adored. He didn't sign up out of rage or nationalism. He signed up because in his world, in his street, that's simply what men did. The whole neighborhood was going. The posters were everywhere. Your country needs you. And Harry Farr answered. For the first year he served, he was reliable. He showed up. He did what soldiers do. But in 1915, after nearly 12 months of constant exposure to shell fire in some of the most vicious fighting of the entire war, something inside Harry began to break. He was admitted to a field hospital, not for a physical wound, for his nerves. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. He couldn't hear orders clearly over a ringing that never left his ears. He would freeze at the sound of incoming shells. Not strategically, not deliberately. His body simply stopped responding, like a machine with a broken gear. Here's where it gets interesting. He was sent back to the front, twice. Each time the trembling got worse. The episodes got longer. The medical reports noted his condition, but no one stopped to ask what was causing it. In 1916, after a third breakdown during a bombardment, Harry refused to go forward toward the front line. He didn't run toward Germany. He didn't abandon his post under enemy fire. He stood in the communication trench, shaking, unable to move, and told his officer he simply could not go on. His sergeant later said, and remember these words, that Harry was shaking like a leaf, that his voice was barely recognizable, that he looked like a man who had already died and simply hadn't laid down yet. But instead of a doctor, what Harry Farr got was a court-martial, and the charge read, cowardice in the face of the enemy. What happened next should have been impossible in a civilized nation, but it wasn't. But here's what's strange. Harry's medical records existed. The field hospital had documented his condition multiple times. Someone knew, several people knew. And yet, at his court-martial, not a single medical witness was called. No doctor testified on his behalf. His entire defense lasted less than 20 minutes. The court-martial of Harry Farr took place on September 2nd, 1916. 3 officers sat in judgment. Harry stood before them without a legal representative. Soldiers accused of cowardice were routinely denied proper counsel. The system wasn't built to hear their side. Harry tried to speak. He told them about his shaking, about the noise, about the way time seemed to collapse around him during bombardments. Seconds stretching into hours, his mind cutting in and out like a faulty signal. One of the officers reportedly looked bored. The evidence against Harry was a single statement from a non-commissioned officer who claimed Harry had refused to go to the trenches. That was it. No witness to contradict it. No medical expert to contextualize it. Harry was found guilty. The sentence, death by firing squad. The confirmation came through the chain of command quickly. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, the commander of British forces, signed off on hundreds of such sentences. He believed, deeply and without doubt, that making an example of men like Harry was necessary for military discipline. That fear of execution would override the fear of battle. He was wrong. History would prove him wrong. But in 1916, his word was final. Now think about what Harry Farr's final days must have been like. Locked in a military cell, away from his wife. His daughter, who was barely 2 years old, would grow up without a father. And she would grow up being told her father was a coward. That word would follow the Farr family for nearly a century. Gertrude, Harry's wife, wrote letters begging for clemency. She described her husband's condition in desperate, plain language. She wasn't a doctor. She didn't have the right terminology, but she knew what she saw. Her letters were ignored. On October 18, 1916, at dawn, Harry Farr was marched to a field, tied to a post, and shot. He was 25 years old, and the British Army recorded his death with a single word: cowardice. But that word, that one brutal, reductive word, was hiding something far more disturbing about the nature of this war and the men who ran it. In 1917, a British Army doctor named W.H.R. Rivers began documenting something extraordinary. Soldiers returning from the front were not simply nervous or weak-willed. They were exhibiting consistent, repeatable symptoms: tremors, paralysis, memory loss, total emotional withdrawal, uncontrollable fear responses. Symptoms that looked, to those paying attention, less like cowardice and more like a kind of invisible injury. It was being called shell shock. We know it today as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, one of the most recognized and studied psychological conditions in modern medicine. But in 1916, the British military establishment had a different interpretation. They believed shell shock was either a physical concussion from nearby explosions, or worse, a form of weakness, a character flaw, something a real soldier simply wouldn't have. The men executing men like Harry Farr were not monsters. They were products of a system that had no language for psychological trauma, a system that believed courage was a fixed resource you either had or you didn't. What they didn't understand, what nobody truly understood yet, was that the human mind has limits. That exposure to prolonged, extreme violence doesn't just scar the body, it rewires the brain, it shuts down systems, it creates a kind of damage that looks, from the outside, exactly like cowardice. Harry Farr wasn't a coward. He was a 25-year-old man whose mind had been destroyed by over a year of industrial warfare. He was not weak, he was broken, and the army he served shot him for it. The night before his execution, Harry Farr was allowed to write a letter. We don't know exactly what it said. The full contents have never been confirmed publicly, but we know he wrote to Gertrude. Imagine sitting in a military cell, in the dark, in France, knowing that when the sun rises, you will die. Not because you were brave enough to face the enemy, but because your body failed you at the worst possible moment. He was not a criminal. He was not a traitor. He was a man who answered his country's call. gave everything he had, and when there was nothing left to give, was told that wasn't enough. At dawn, a small group of soldiers, men who perhaps shook with their own hidden tremors, raised their rifles. A blindfold, a post, silence, and then a single volley. Harry Farr was gone. His daughter Gertrude, named after her mother, spent the rest of her life trying to clear her father's name. She grew up carrying a stigma that was never hers to bear. She faced it at school, in the community, in the silence that fell when she mentioned her father's name. She died in 2005. 1 year later, in 2006, the British government issued a blanket posthumous pardon for all 306 soldiers executed during World War I. 90 years too late. Gertrude never heard the words her father deserved to hear. Pardoned, innocent, not a coward. Just a man who broke under the weight of something no human being should ever have been asked to bear. 306 men, shot at dawn. Each one had a name. Each one had a family. Each one served a country that ultimately turned its rifle on them. The story of Harry Farr is not an exception. It is a window into the darkest flaw of the First World War. Not just the enemy's cruelty, but the institutional cruelty of a military machine that could not accept human vulnerability. We have come a long way since then. Shell shock has a name now, a diagnosis, a treatment. Soldiers are no longer executed for breaking down. But let's sit with this question for a moment. If you had been in those trenches, if you had seen what Harry Farr saw, felt what he felt, endured what he endured, what would you have done? Were they cowards or victims of a war no human being was built to survive? You decide.